Hello everyone! Welcome to yet another day in the clown decade, except this time round we actually have something getting a tiny bit better, while at the same time everything else gets a lot worse. And you know me, I like these white-pilled videos more than anyone, because they are great to make, and they cheer everyone up for the weekend. So, what has happened? Well, if you've not catched my last two videos on Farage, links as usual will be in the description. I'll give you a quick rundown now. Coutts, which is an elite bank in London, decided one day just to let Farage know that he is going to have his account closed, and they didn't give him any particular reason why, but said that they would. He then got a letter later on, just reiterating that his accounts will be closed, and that they were not going to give him a reason for it. So he went round trying to find alternative banks to get a business and personal account for, because they offered him a basic NatWest one, which would have been no use to him. And he was struggling to get an account anywhere, so he was pushing on Coutts to either reinstate his account or to find out why he was kicked out. And so he put in a subject to information request, because if a company has information on you, you have every right to see what that information is. So in my last video, I went through that entire document, and to just put it in a word, it was a hatchet job. Well, that's two words, but you get the idea. Where they were constantly taking references from The Guardian, which is not very well known for keeping things objective. They even had Guardian opinion pieces, which is even worse. Hope not hate, and we're taking quotes from radical leftists as gospel, and that is the worst way I think you can actually run a background check on someone. And so now we're here. We know Farage was kicked out for political reasons, and the dossier itself said that Farage actually did fit the criteria for holding an account there. In other words, he had enough money. So Farage decided to dig deep on who the person was who ended up actually making the decision to get Farage kicked out of Coutts.
Extraordinary. 3 times I've now written to the CEO of Coutts, Peter Flavel. Yep, he's the boss of that NatWest subsidiary. He's the one whose Risk, Reputation and Wealth Committee has plunged the bank into perhaps its biggest crisis in 331 years. And you know what? After 3 times of writing, I've not yet even had an acknowledgement. Whether he's just asleep at the wheel, simply couldn't care less, or is scared and has gone into hiding, I simply don't know. But given that 39% of the whole NatWest group is owned by you and I, the taxpayer, I don't find this particularly acceptable. I'm beginning to think that heads really will need to roll.
Yes, Farage here on a I am taking no prisoners warpath. It is absolutely disgusting what has happened to him, and it's obviously happened to many other people, as we will get into, but Farage is obviously the biggest name that this has happened to. And he is right. He needs to take scalps. There absolutely does need to be consequences for these actions. And this, of course, comes from Twitter, and he was just trying to target the CEO of Coutts there, but obviously it's a subsidiary of NatWest, who ultimately will have a say in who and who cannot have a bank account at Coutts. And so Nigel Farage put out this statement: Dame Alison Rose has now admitted that she is the source. She broke client confidentiality, is unfit to be the CEO of NatWest Group. Meanwhile, Coutts CEO Peter Flavel must take the ultimate responsibility for debanking me based on my political views. So he's taking aim at 2 people there, Dame Alison Rose and Peter Flavel. But he goes on to say, Sir Howard Davis is responsible for overall governance. He has clearly failed in this task, least of all by endorsing their conduct. In my view, they should all go. So Farage has made his targets very clear. CEO of both NatWest Group and the CEO of Coutts, and also the entire board of directors for NatWest Group. Because all of these people do have a hand in this horrible decision. And he's also put a quick note up about the conduct rules, and obviously one of the rules is pay due regard to the interests of customers and treat them fairly, and also must be an open and cooperative with the FCA, the PRA and other regulators, because these regulators will obviously say don't leak out private information about customers, and that's exactly what Dame Alison Rose did by telling Simon Jack of the BBC that Farage did not meet the financial criteria to hold a bank at Coutts. And that turns out not to be true, as we have all seen from the information and the dossier that Nigel Farage showed. So on the same day as this, NatWest put out a customer service update about the group board and chief executive officer of NatWest Group. From Howard Davies, chairman of NatWest Group, the board has noted Alison Rose's statement on the circumstances of a conversation with Simon Jack and a further apology to Mr. Farage. So we got an apology, obviously, but obviously that's not good enough for Mr. Farage or any of us, to be honest. He should just have his bank account fully reinstated and everyone should be replaced by people much more competent. As she recognises, she should not have spoken in the way she did. This was a regrettable error of judgment on her part. The events will be taken into account in decisions on remuneration at the appropriate time. However, after careful reflection, the board has concluded that it retains full confidence in Miss Rose as CEO of the bank. She's proven over the last 4 years to be an outstanding leader of the institution, as demonstrated by our results. The board therefore believes it is clearly in the interest of all the bank shareholders and customers that she continues in post. The board is clear that the overall handling of the circumstances surrounding Mr. Farage's accounts has been unsatisfactory, with serious consequences for the bank. The board will commission an independent review into the account closure arrangement at Coutts, and lessons will be learned from this. The findings of that review will be made public on completion. The terms of reference and lead firm will be announced shortly. In other words, she made such a colossal mistake that the board of directors had to directly make a statement about the mistake and then say we will be doing a huge review into this mistake to see why both Farage's accounts were closed when clearly there was no reasonable reason to, and why Dame Alison Ross was going about gossiping about Nigel Farage's accounts. 2 correspondents from the BBC, of all people. But despite all that, the CEO still have full confidence behind Dame Alison Rose and have decided to keep her as CEO, despite 2 major blunders. So Dame Alison Rose, CEO of NatWest Group. I recognise that in my conversations with Simon Jack of the BBC, I made a serious error of judgment in discussing Mr. Farage's relationship with the bank. Given the consequence of this, I want to address the questions that have been raised and set out the substance of the conversation that took place. In other words, let me tell you why I am gossipy. Odds are it's because she's a woman. Believing it was public knowledge, I confirmed that Mr. Farage was a Coutts customer and that he had been offered a NatWest bank account. So here's the thing. It is technically true that it was public knowledge that Nigel Farage had accounts with Coutts. The thing is that it comes from one article from the Times, and Nigel Farage didn't even make that public. It must have been, I believe it was the Times' own investigative journalism where they found the mortgage deed to a house that Nigel Farage had bought, and it had been obviously through Coutts. And the dossier obviously had this information on it, and that's why she thought it was public knowledge. But if she had actually been listening to anything that Nigel Farage has said, she would know that Nigel Farage was avoiding even mentioning the bank until it became public knowledge through Alison Coutts. So that just goes to show how little she really cared about this whole situation. She didn't care a fig what Nigel Farage had to say about it. She just wanted him out of there, clearly. Alongside this, I repeated what Mr. Farage had already stated, that the bank saw this as a commercial decision. I'd like to emphasise that in responding to Mr. Jack's questions, I did not reveal any personal financial information about Mr. Farage. Well, you must have, because he reported that he didn't have enough money. In response to a general question about eligibility criteria required to bank with Coutts and NatWest, I said that guidance on both was publicly available on their website. In doing so, I recognised that I left Mr. Jack with the impression that the decision to close Mr. Farage's account was solely a commercial one. That is hilarious. Why wouldn't he be left with the impression that it was a wholly commercial one? Nigel Farage is saying that he's getting letters saying it's a commercial one. You're saying it's a commercial one. Why would he assume it's anything else? I was not part of the decision-making process to exit Mr. Farage. This decision was made by Coutts, and I was informed in April that this was for commercial reasons. At the time of my conversation with Mr. Jack, I was not in receipt of the content of the Coutts Wealth Reputational Risk Committee materials subsequently released by Mr. Farage. So how did you know it was public knowledge? This is how not public knowledge it was. Yes, I know there was that Times article, but when Farage was going on about having this account closed, absolutely no one, I couldn't even find a source on Twitter that linked back to this Times article to say that it was Coutts. So basically nobody knew. Anyway, let's just take her at her word. I've apologised to Mr. Farage for the deeply inappropriate language contained in those papers, and the board has commissioned a full independent review into the decision and process to ensure that it cannot happen again. Put simply, I was wrong to respond to any question raised by the BBC about the case. That's true. I want to extend my sincere apology to Mr. Farage for the personal hurt that this has caused him, and I have written to him today. Are you offering him an account back? I doubt it. I would like to say sorry to the board and my colleagues. I started my career working for National Westminster Bank. It is an institution I care enormously about and have always been proud to be part of it. It has been the privilege of my career to lead the bank, and I am grateful to the board for entrusting me with this role. It is therefore all the more regrettable that my actions have compounded an already difficult issue for the group. So the state of play with Coutts and NatWest Group was just that. We had apologies from the board of directors and the CEO of NatWest Group, saying that they will review all the mistakes they've made and how this information got out, and hopefully we will never see people like Nigel Farage lose their bank account for political reasons again, and yet everyone keeps their jobs. The thing is, you come into Wednesday morning, you're greeted with headlines like this. NatWest boss Alison Rose quits after Nigel Farage Coutts row. Bank chief admitted leaking information about account to BBC. This is what we call a total victory for Farage. And is it enough for him? Absolutely not. You've got to absolutely love it. The chief executive of NatWest has resigned after admitting she leaked private information about Nigel Farage's finances to the BBC. Well done. Dame Alison Rose has been facing pressure from Downing Street, the Chancellor, and other senior cabinet ministers to resign. Yes, I have to commend the Tories, and especially the cabinet, on this particular issue. They have been pushing for consequences for this horrific action from NatWest. Because obviously leaking personal information like that you shouldn't keep your job after it, especially as a CEO. And especially with the whole thing from losing your account for political reasons, obviously that should never be happening. And yet it is, which is why Farage is pushing for much more than just Alison Rose to go. So Howard Davis, the NatWest Group chairman, said the board and Alison Rose have agreed by mutual consent that she will step down as CEO of the NatWest Group. It is a sad moment. She has dedicated all her working life so far to NatWest and will leave many colleagues who respect and admire her. Rose thanked her colleagues for all that they have done, adding, I remain immensely proud of the progress the bank has made in supporting people, families and business across the UK and building the foundations for sustainable growth. So, that's very funny because of what we'll get into later. Because the bank isn't really for supporting people, families and businesses across the UK for very spurious reasons, and it's not just NatWest that fall into this trap. But of course, because cabinet ministers were calling for consequences for horrific business actions, for some reason, a lot of the left wing are in favour of keeping a big multinational bank CEO in place directly after they have treated one of their customers beyond horribly. It's a very strange case, and here's a perfect example of what I mean. NatWest CEO Alison Rose has been bullied over Nigel Farage Coutts case, Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves says. So, a shadow cabinet member from the Tory party thinks that a CEO has been bullied out of her position by Nigel Farage. That is hilarious. Rachel Reeves made her intervention hours before Miss Rose stepped down after admitting she was the source of the inaccurate story about Nigel Farage's bank account. So here's the clip of that.
I don't like some of frankly, what I see as bullying attitudes towards her. She's the first female chief executive of NatWest. She took over at a time when that bank had real big problems.
It's just such strange logic. Oh, I don't like the fact there are some bullying attitudes. Okay, what bullying attitudes do you mean? Oh, well, she's the first female CEO of the company. What? So she shouldn't lose her job for breaking GDPR? And she may well have done well in the past. I don't know. She came in 4 years ago, so that was during the pandemic. So I can only imagine that the stock prices tanked during that time. But I just find it hilarious how this entire company has effectively depersoned Nigel Farage, and somehow it is the CEO of the mega corporation that is being bullied.
It seems to me that Alison Rose has done a good job turning that bank around, but I don't know the details of this specific case.
Oh, perfect. Just fully admitting that she doesn't know anything about the case, she doesn't know what she's talking about, and yet she's just saying, these people are calling her for her to be fired, they must be bullies.
Let me say this, if I was in the Treasury at the moment, rather than Jeremy Hunt and his Conservative ministers, I'd be spending my time this summer trying to ensure that families in Scarborough, like the ones I've spoken to today, are properly protected during this cost of living crisis.
Yeah, a good way to do that would probably be to make sure that banks can't take their accounts away from them for very spurious reasons. That's probably a pretty good way to ensure that they have money.
Rather than picking a fight with banks on behalf of Nigel Farage.
I want you to remember clips like this where it's, oh, these people clearly don't care about the common man or anything like that. They just care that Nigel Farage gets his bank account back, and that's where it ends. I mean, again, we'll go into it later, but my God, the self-righteousness of these leftists who admit they don't know anything about the situation and then feel like they can comment things like that on it is just absurd. And she wasn't the only one white knighting for Dame Alison Rose's awful, awful handling of the situation. Here is Emily Maitlis, ex-BBC presenter, who said the whole BBC is a right-wing diatribe, on her new podcast talking about the situation.
If you put to one side the leaking of customer confidentiality, which we probably all agree was egregious.
So if you ignore one of the really bad parts about this whole situation, is not a very good way to start a conversation on a topic like this.
I think the one thing we've learned from all of this is how to whip up a populist storm. Because at the heart of this is the choice by one private bank to say no to one customer who they decided was costing them too much and wasn't bringing them in enough money.
How could he possibly be costing the bank anything? She's clearly still going along with the lie that he didn't have enough money to keep a bank account at Coutts, but as the dossier showed, and as a journalist you should be reading if you are commenting on this case, that turned out to be hogwash. Wasn't true. It was a fairy tale. That point came up twice, and they contradicted each other. They completely contradicted each other. One time it said, no, he doesn't have enough, and then later on it said, oh, no, he actually does. And we can't actually know, because obviously it's not going to tell us exactly how much money he had in his account. But that was 2 points on a 40-page document. The rest of it was all evidence about how he was either racist, homophobic, or against climate change. And if you remember that climate change one, the only evidence they had for it was a Guardian opinion piece.
They offered him another high street bank like 95% of the population use, and that wasn't good enough.
Why should he stand for being discriminated against because of his political beliefs? Why should he stand for that? And again, if you would listen to him, they only offered him a personal account. He needs both a personal and business account. They weren't offering him a business account, so they were clearly, actively giving him a worse service, discriminating based on his political beliefs, as the dossier states. Please do your job as a journalist and actually read into the stories you're commenting on.
And he made it. Farage made it an argument about free speech, about liberty, about censorship, when it wasn't. No one was shutting him down. No one was stopping him from banking. No one was calling him names.
Here is just a tiniest bit, the tiniest bit of a snippet of the document. Racism, xenophobia, BLM, anti-Semitism. This is name calling. That's exactly what that is. And if you look there, all that evidence is, their top bit of evidence for him being anti-Semitic here is because some Jewish groups criticised him because he used the word globalist to describe Grant Shapps. Shapps. And then they have the gall to try and say, clearly he's exactly like Alex Jones because he went and was interviewed by Alex Jones a couple of times. By the way, Alex Jones said this about the Sandy Hook school shooting, as if Nigel Farage agrees with that. All they did was name-call him and take away his bank account because of it. How can you talk about Farage being debanked and say no one took his bank account away? That is absurd.
They simply waited until he'd paid off a mortgage, having decided ahead of time that they would call it quits at that point.
Yeah, they didn't even have the decency to forewarn him it was happening. He found out about 2 weeks before it was actually happening. You know, they had the good grace to say, you know what, we'll let him pay us the money we owe, but we're going to hold off on this decision for a few quarters. And then part of the reason that they don't have good PR for this is, as the dossier went through, Farage paid his mortgage off early. And so they had automatic systems to debank him, And they were like, oh, by the way, it's already happening. And they were like, oh, we need to get ready for this then. It's ridiculous. It is the most ridiculous situation I think I've seen. I don't know how you can't see that the bank is being scummy here.
And this isn't a public utility. It's not electricity. It's a posh private bank. It's in the name.
It's not a private bank. It's 40% owned. Well, it's a subsidiary of a group that is 40% owned by the public. So no, it's actually not a private bank. And yes, it is posh. Doesn't matter though. It's the principle of the damn thing. You should not have any service taken away from you for your political beliefs. And given that basically every wage these days is paid in cheques or goes direct debit to a bank account, of course it's a public utility these days. It's probably more essential than having water pipes and having electricity. What a ridiculous statement.
Yet the power of the populist somehow is to turn utter entitlement into victimhood, and that is quite the move.
Look, if this was just about the fact that he didn't have enough money to have a bank account, that would be fine. It would be absurd to try and turn yourself into a victim that way, I do agree. It's not what happened though, and the entire dossier says that, and yet you have obviously didn't bother to read it, and are now turning it, ironically, into a cry-bully situation, where you are trying to make out that this CEO who made huge mistakes as the chief executive officer of this bank is now the victim of a populist mob, which just isn't the case at all, as we can tell from the dossier, as we can tell from everything that has happened since. And I mean, for God's sake, the woman is a CEO of a multinational bank. She's going to get a massive payout, and there's already speculation that the department chief executive of NatWest may get a multi-million payoff, and is likely to spark further criticism of a bank that had only just recovered from the scandal that brought it close to collapse in the previous incarnation as the Royal Bank of Scotland. Dame Alison Rose left immediately by mutual consent yesterday morning after she admitted she was the source of the leak about Nigel Farage's banking details, and the Information Commission's officer is examining whether her actions constitute a serious data breach. Well, of course it does, but as we say, there's speculation that she could get a multi-million pound payoff. And she probably will, because you fail upwards when you are that high up. Further evidence of this is the chief of the board of directors for NatWest Group, who is Howard Davis. He is a Manchester-born economist who has served in some of the UK's biggest regulatory roles. He has been part of NatWest Group chairman for almost 9 years. He was previously the inaugural chairman of the Financial Services Authority, a deputy governor at the Bank of England, and a director of the London School of Economics, which explains quite a lot. That is a particularly leftist university. He resigned in 2011 from the LSE after admitting that a decision to accept a 1.5 million donation from Saif al-Islam, Colonel Gaddafi's son, had damaged the university's reputation. See what I mean? You fail upwards. He ends up on a board of directors at NatWest after a clear case of corruption. Other jobs have included boardroom seats at Wall Street's bank Morgan Stanley and pension giant Prudential, as well as stints chairing Phoenix and the UK Airports Commission. The 72-year-old has previously announced he will retire by July 2024. Well, he shouldn't even have a job in any of these places if he is corrupt, as we can see he is. So anyway, as I've mentioned a few times in this video, it's not just Nigel Farage that NatWest has decided to discriminate against. There was also this story that came out today. Alexandra Tolstoy asks NatWest for full story after account shut. It seems that it's not just Nigel Farage who is entitled to bank accounts. 2 months ago, Countess Alexandra Tolstoy received a letter telling her that NatWest would soon be closing her accounts. The letter gave her no reasoning or rationale, but as a former partner of Sergei Pugachev, a Russian oligarch once known as Putin's banker, she had her suspicions. She had not spoken to the father of her 3 children for 7 years and received no maintenance for him. After appeals and requests for further information were rebuffed by the bank, Tolstoy, 49, did some digging and found out that she was classified as a politically exposed person by a data company that does checks for high street banks. On false premise, they used 3 Daily Mail articles and a Russian article, she told the BBC. She tried writing to NatWest and told that the PEP classification was false, but still the bank did not reinstate her account nor give any more information about why it remained closed. So, yeah, it just seems that there are very spurious PEP claims going about, and the bank appears to go out of its way to not tell these people that they have this status, won't tell them that they are closing it because of this status, and give absolutely no recourse on how not to be a PEP. And it appears there's even companies that are just dedicated to finding these spurious claims about politically exposed people and getting their accounts knocked down because of it, with absolutely no way to appeal. That's actually quite insane. But I suppose you might be saying, well, it could be reasonable that she was a politically exposed person. She was married to Putin's banker. Well, okay then. What about this next story? The customers complaining they had their bank accounts closed without any explanation. A retired policeman, Anthony Seal, was not told why his account was closed, and a bricklayer had to turn to his mother-in-law to lend him money to pay his staff. So it's not just Coutts, it's not just Nigel Farage, it's not just people with some sort of connection to Russia, it is everyone. Everyone is at risk of this. When Anthony Seal was medically retired from the Greater Manchester Police at the age of 36, it was with more than 15 years service under his belt. His career was cut short during an arrest in 2021 when he pulled the car over and grabbed the steering wheel before the driver sped off, leaving Anthony badly injured. His right leg needed reconstruction with a metal plate, and his recovery was hampered by mental health issues, which led him to be medically retired. Poor guy. His recovery was going well until one day in August when he discovered his bank account had been shut while checking it on his phone app. Anthony found he could no longer access it. I was at a really low point when NatWest shut my account in August 2021. There was nothing much in the accounts between £1,000 and £3,000 coming from the Department of Work and Pensions, so we're entirely traceable. I've been with NatWest for years. I immediately thought I'd been victim of fraud, and of course, as a former police officer, it set alarm bells ringing. I rang NatWest, and I passed through to the fraud department, and they said they couldn't tell me why my account was closed. And when I went to the bank, and I had to say that my account's been shut down, people just assumed you must have done something wrong. I felt like a criminal. And yes, that's the problem. When you don't feel like you can be part of civilised society, you are just going to feel like you've done something wrong. And I don't think any of these people have. And if they have, NatWest needs to tell them. Was it a person or an algorithm that had made the decision? I thought I was going to lose my disability pension money, so I wrote a letter to the chief executive, Alison Rose. In his letter, Anthony outlined the fact that he had mental health issues or hidden disabilities, which NatWest had championed in its advertising campaigns. It's the classic New Elite thing, isn't it? I am for this good thing and that good thing. And then when it comes to actually supporting these people, they suck at it, or actively do the opposite, as we can see here. He was shocked when he read the reply from her office. One thing stands out. It asked if I had tried speaking to my GP or Citizens Advice. That told me nobody was listening. Yes, it was clearly just an automatic reply almost. And so now Anthony banks with Lloyds and volunteers in an advisory role for security firms. So, you know, he's not been completely killed off by this, but my God, you would feel awful if this is how you were treated by your bank for doing apparently nothing wrong. Since Nigel Farage spoke publicly about his Coutts account being closed without consultation, Money Mail has spoken to dozens of people whose bank accounts were also shut abruptly without any explanation. In each case, the account holder had repeatedly called, emailed and tried for months on end without success to find out the reason for the bank's decision. And while most banks made contact with their customers by email, one young restaurant manager was shocked to be sent a text, which ended with, "We have decided to end our banking relationship with you." 1 year later, she has still not received an explanation. And there's plenty more stories about that in the article from many different banks as well, so you can read them at your own leisure. But as I said in the first video on, I guess what we can call this series, yeah, this has happened to Farage, sure, but this has been happening to other people at a lot lower level for decades from the sounds of it. I mean, I used as an example in the first video Laura Towler, who is someone I don't not like her personally. She's probably very good, but her politics I don't particularly like at all. I don't think she should be debanked or treated in similar ways to this, where they just close her account and don't tell her why. And as we can see from this article, it has been happening to literal nobodies. And I could not give you a good reason as to why the bank would do that. I can't think of one. I can't think of one at all. And so in response, Nigel Farage is actually doing something about it. Mad respect to him for this. My war on woke banks is about to rapidly expand. I am now seriously motivated by this. The desperation of many people who have been wronged means that I simply have to do something. And yes, honestly, I would go through that article I've just gone through, link in the description, because there are some horrible stories in there of people having to borrow from family members to pay their business staff. because NatWest and other companies just decided to close their account for no reason. Dame Alison Rose's resignation was inevitable. Having broken the first rule of banking by breaching client confidentiality, she had to go. Now the rest of NatWest board must follow, under the chairmanship, or should I say chairpersonship, of Sir Howard Davis. They endorsed Rose's behaviour by backing her. Absolutely. They've been hoisted by their own petard here. An emergency root and branch examination of what has happened at NatWest under Rose's leadership must now take place. In recent years, this bank, 39% owned by the taxpayer, remember, has morphed into a woke warrior. It has become obsessed with public displays of political correctness rather than focusing on the business of managing and making money. The truth is that, in its quest to promote diversity and inclusion, the corporate giants have turned it into a divisive and poisonous monster. And as we can see from all the stories we've gone through before, it is clearly something to do with that, because I can't think of any other good reason that they would stop all these accounts. And finding out what people have said on Twitter is ridiculously easy if they're not anonymous. It now seems that British banks are also marching down this one-way street. They do it in part to deflect customers' attention from the fact that they exist to make vast profits. They want people to think that they are nicey-nicey, but they know this isn't how corporate life in a capitalist society really works, and this is probably why so many leftists have come to the defence of Alison Rose, despite the fact that she is basically there to make money for the shareholders. Banks can be a force for good, but not by discriminating against people with whom they happen to disagree. I hope that this week marks a turning point. The City Minister, Andrew Griffith, has read the Riot Act to the 19 bank bosses who were summoned to the Treasury for a meeting. This is a good start. People's lawfully held political and personal opinions should have nothing to do with their right to a bank account. Banks should not be and must never become political organisations. Any bank that treats a single customer in this way that Coutts acted towards me must have its licence revoked, and I would be perfectly on board with that. They can't get away with it. Alison Rose needs to be the first of many people who effectively get scalped out of the banking industry, because they can't be trusted. They can't be trusted at all. They have completely broken down any relationship and trust people have in banks. I am seriously motivated by this issue. The desperation of those that have been wronged by big banks means that I simply have to do something. I may not have picked this fight, but I now find myself right in the middle of it. I'll be launching over the course of the next few days an exercise designed to gather together all of those that have been debanked. I'm hoping to build a very large database of cases to find out which banks are the worst offenders and what the commonest reasons are, so that we can prepare and present to a lobby to ministers and to Parliament in order to achieve fundamental change. Yes, this is how you enact change. You get organised and lobby where the levers of power are, and hopefully this will result in something, anything, that stops banks from being able to do what they did to Farage and these other poor people. I don't know whether it's going to happen under a Tory or Labour government, though. It might be said that the cultural problems within our banks has, so far at least, only affected a small proportion of the population. But if these institutions continue to believe they can become moral arbiters, monitoring the social media profiles of account holders, the numbers affected will quickly grow. Our current rulebook, backed up by aggressive compliance departments, has proved to be a sledgehammer that has missed the nut. It isn't money launderers, but innocent people who are paying the price. It simply cannot continue. I'll be asking people out there to come and join me. Let's fight this. And as I said before, just excellent. It's exactly what we need at the moment. This is how you win on the political field, and this is a winning field. He's already got one scalp from NatWest. I would be shocked if that is the only person who steps down here. This is just the start of a very long battle, and as we can clearly see, we have found mush. And Farage knows this, and that's why he's pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. And hopefully with enough backing, he can actually influence Parliament and ministers to do something about this, what is clearly a growing problem. The bank's picked too big a target in Farage, and it's ended up actually just causing a lot more damage than if they had just kept him. Because Coutts did this for reputational reasons. They thought that their reputation would be better after this whole scenario than if they kept him on. No one knew that he was part of Coutts, though, apart from obviously one Times article that no one knew about until it was in the dossier. And so it was clearly just the complete wrong decision, so I wouldn't be surprised if the Coutts CEO goes next. Well, isn't that timing? I googled to find out if he actually has stepped down, and Coutts' chief executive resigns over Nigel Farage rel. Peter Favell steps down less than 48 hours after his boss, Alison Rose, was forced to quit. Well, isn't that just breaking news? The head of the private bank Coutts has resigned less than 48 hours after the department of his boss, NatWest Chief Executive Alison Rose, amid over a growing row over former UKIP leaders Nigel Farage's bank account. Peter Favell stepped down by mutual consent with immediate effect, said NatWest Group's acting chief executive Paul Thwaite. While I will be personally sorry to lose Peter as a colleague, I believe this is the right decision for Coutts and the wider group, Thwaite said. I have asked Mohammed Kamal Said to step into the role of interim CEO of Coutts and our wealth businesses. Mo has extensive wealth management experience and is the ideal person to lead Coutts through this difficult time as we begin to search for Peter's replacement. Pavel, who has led the private bank since 2016, said in a statement, I am exceptionally proud of my 7 years at Coutts, and I want to thank the team that have built it in such a high-performing business. In the handling of Mr. Farage's case, we have fallen below the bank's high standards of personal service. As CEO of Coutts, it is right that I bear ultimate responsibility for this, which is why I am stepping down. It's just great. It's great to see this. Farage is just absolutely mowing them down. He's basically machine gunning them at this point. I mean, I guarantee this is not going to be the final video I make in this series. There's got to be many, many more because there are so many people who Farage has to kick out of positions of power like this because clearly they are just abusing it and they are doing things that is not helping a civil society. It's actively going against what a civil society should be. And it's sending clear incentives to CEOs of big banks to say, hey, don't kick people out of banks for spurious political reasons or even be very careful about politically exposed people. Clearly, be careful about that. Because if you do debank someone for a terrible reason like this, then you are going to be added to the database and you will be ranked on how bad you are for basically being a civil bank. And I really hope that Farage keeps pushing on this mush because it is an easy target for all of us. It's something that, frankly, everyone agrees has been an injustice. And I can see him going very far with his work to try and stop this woke capitalism. Apparently, I didn't think it would be this. I didn't think big banks would be this big target that we all see. But apparently it is. And honestly, that is like taking out one of the biggest enemy regiments because banks seem to be one of the biggest pushers for the woke agenda, for lack of a better term, the push for leftist politics in ordinary life. And so maybe they are finally getting the incentive to not do that. And if that happens, hey, that is a huge win for us. So let's celebrate the start of this, but bear in mind, it's going to take a lot more work and time. We're in the clown decade after all. There's still a lot more that could go worse and probably will go worse. But hey, that was everything I had for you today. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.